Let me read to you a passage from the 7th chapter of St. John's Gospel, verses 1 to 2, and then 10, and then 25 to 30, all in the one passage. It's the Gospel for Friday of the 4th week of Lent. St. John writes, "After this, Jesus went around in Galilee, purposely staying away from Judea, because the Jews there were waiting to take his life. But when the Jewish feast of tabernacles was near, after his brothers had left for the feast, he went also, not publicly, but in secret. At that point, some of the people of Jerusalem began to ask, 'Isn't this the man they are trying to kill? Here he is, speaking publicly, and they are not saying a word to him. Have the authorities really concluded that he is the Christ? But we know where this man is from. When the Christ comes, no one will know where he is from.' Then Jesus, teaching in the temple courts, cried out, 'Yes, you know me, and you know where I am from. I am not here on my own, but he who sent me is true. You do not know him, but I know him because I am from him and he sent me.' At this they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him because his time had not yet come." That's from chapter 7 of St. John's Gospel, verses 1 to 2, and 10, and 25 to 30. And what does it suggest to us? Well, one of the very intriguing things in human history are patterns of success and failure. We see certain persons who are able and who are good, and yet who, humanly speaking, seem to fail. That is to say, they do not gain status, social influence, and the praise of the many. They even end their lives in oblivion. Whereas others, perhaps of less ability, fewer human and moral qualities, and much less possession of the truth, do well in society and end their days with the praise of men. Now, some who observe this phenomenon go on to imagine that ultimate success is indicated and defined in terms of social influence, status, and the praise of others. Some even see the very truth of a person's position to be tested and manifested by the extent of its acceptance by those around him. For instance, some have been of the view that Mahomet's social, political, and military success vindicated the truth of his religious message. He ended his days having attained a remarkable ascendancy in his own region, and the Muslim armies extended it at a stunning rate after his death. It showed that Allah was with him, confirming the truth of his utterances. Of course, if this were all that there was to the case for Islam, a serious thinker could not be persuaded. After all, Genghis Khan had extraordinary success. Or again, at a spiritual level, the Arians and the Nestorians had great success over various centuries. I introduce this issue, though, not to discuss it at length, but simply to set forth the pattern that marked the life of Christ. Who can deny his greatness? Who can question the loftiness of his message, nor the holiness of his person, nor the remarkable powers he had to work miracles? These are facts which even Muhammad himself accepted, even if he got no further than looking on Christ, as did so many in his own day, as but a prophet, like the others before him, and not even to be rated on a level with himself. So then, Christ our Lord was great, but my point here is, look at how different was the pattern of his life, as alluded to in our gospel today. Within the parameters of his life, Christ did not have much success, if we define success in terms of status, influence upon those who matter, and the praise and adulation of the many. Consider the death of Christ on the cross, and consider, by contrast, the death of Muhammad. The one involved tremendous rejection, the other was marked by widespread adulation. Of course, as already mentioned, the Christian would say that acceptance and adulation is no necessary indicator of the truth. And to assume that it is just that, it's an assumption. But what I'm doing here is setting in relief a striking pattern in the life of Christ, namely that his path was one of rejection, and it went against the ways of the world. He did not seek adulation, and indeed he knew it was not the path of God. In our gospel today we read that, and I quote, Jesus went around in Galilee, purposely staying away from Judea because the Jews there were waiting to take his life. And then when our Lord did go to Jerusalem, we read that at that point some of the people of Jerusalem began to ask, "Isn't this the man they are trying to kill?" That is to say, our Lord did not gain the acceptance of those who mattered. Indeed, the more he announced the central features of his doctrine, the more he lost his own disciples. We read in St. John's Gospel in chapter 6, preceding the chapter of our passage today, that when our Lord taught the doctrine of the Eucharist, that he was to give his flesh to eat and his blood to drink, very many of his disciples left him. But so it had to be, for our Lord immediately turned to the 12 and asked if they were going to leave him too. There was to be no turning back from the truth he had come to reveal. He even lost one of the 12, who at a subsequent point went off to betray him. In our gospel today, we read that his enemies tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him, for his time had not yet come. But the time did eventually come when he allowed himself to be seized, totally rejected, and condemned to death on a cross. The surprise is that in the plan of God, this is how true success was to be gained. Success in the sight of God comes from bearing witness to the truth in the midst of suffering. This is what we learn from the life of Christ. Christ's way is not the way of the world. Simon Peter at one point tried to dissuade our Lord from the path of suffering and the cross. "Get behind me, you Satan," was our Lord's reply. "The way you think is the way of man and not of God." Let us then take our stand with Jesus, bearing in mind constantly his teaching that anyone who wishes to be his disciple must renounce himself, take up his cross every day, and follow in his footsteps. Christ reveals the cross as the path to true success, as God sees it.